Hello, and welcome to the Back of the Pack podcast. I am your guest host this week, Karin Velez. Your usual podcast host dude, Kyle Walker, is off this week, off having some adventure somewhere, which I'm sure we will hear all about when he gets back. So he has turned the reins over to me this week, and he said I could talk about whatever I wanted. So be careful what you ask for, Kyle. Just kidding. When I was thinking about what to talk about, I actually was on my long run yesterday. And like probably all of us have experienced, you're out on a long run and it doesn't really matter what you're listening to in your ear holes, whether it's, a podcast or a playlist or maybe nothing. Maybe you're just listening to Mother Nature and the sounds of nature. And suddenly your brain starts to wander a little bit about halfway through the run. You're no longer paying attention to what you're hearing. That's pretty much what was happening to me. And I found myself thinking about the things that I didn't know when I first started running and that I do know now, and maybe the things that I still don't understand. So when I first started running, it was 2017, and I didn't really become a consistent runner until about 2019. And then in 2020, signed up for my first half marathon. Now, up until this point, I had not had a plan. I didn't have a coach. I still don't have a coach, but I hadn't used any kind of like Couch to 5K program or anything like that. And so I decided maybe it was time to actually follow a plan to get ready for this half marathon. And so I had gotten a Garmin and I just chose one of the free versions of the half marathon training on Garmin and started to follow that. And lo and behold, I get into the training and all of a sudden pops up this thing called a tempo run. I had no idea. Like, what on earth is a tempo run and whose tempo am I running? I was clueless. And I went to go and look up what a tempo run was, how fast I was supposed to be going, how hard I was supposed to be running. And it said, oh, it's somewhere between, an easy run and a hard effort. Okay, so medium effort, medium pace. Well, the problem at that point, and I think this happens to a lot of people who come into the running game late in life or later and didn't really kind of come up in the track scene or ever have a kind of a coach to teach them how to run. When you start running, you just run. You don't know how fast or how hard you're supposed to be running. You just go out and you start running. And that first mile that you attempt to do, you probably can't even run the whole thing. At least I couldn't. It had been years since I had run anything. And I just ran. And then I continued that. Okay, well, I was able to finally get a full mile. Now I'm going to do 2. Now I'm going to do 3 and start running 5Ks. But there was no training and there was no difference between what I was running during the week and what I was trying to race on the weekend, except for maybe a little bit of extra adrenaline. So essentially, I was racing my training. I did not grasp what a tempo run was until I sort of understood the science behind them and subsequently why we should be using them. How does a tempo run help to get us better and faster and stronger as runners? I, at that point, was, not running my easy runs easy enough. I probably still don't. I mean, who's with me on that? And it took me a little bit to figure out the difference between like a speed workout, which is what a tempo run is, and just sort of your regular training runs. So today we are going to talk about the science, talk about why a tempo run works, and talk about what your tempo pace should be when you get these prescribed within your training plans, or if you're creating your own training plans, how to sort of work them in. Now, I'm going to start off by saying I am not a certified trainer. I am not a running coach. None of those things. I am just someone who constantly kind of wants to know the why behind the how of things. Here is my shameless plug for my own podcast because Kyle told me to do this. So I am a podcaster. I have a podcast called the Just Grow Something podcast. It's a podcast for gardeners. And the tagline to that is the why behind the how of gardening. And here's why. I translate that into sort of our running community as well, because when we're told to do these hard workouts, for me, if I understand why it is that I'm supposed to be doing this hard thing, when we get into the middle of that workout and it's getting hard, And our brains are trying to tell us, our primitive brain is saying, stop, slow down. We don't want to hurt yourself. This is not good. We want to go for the easy thing. It's easier for me to keep going in that instance if the other part of my brain has the reason behind why we're doing it, has the logic behind why this is going to benefit us and why it's going to work. So it makes it easier to sort of push that primitive brain aside and say, no, no, we're going to keep going because we know why we're doing it, right? So that's what we're going to get into today. So, when we talk about the tempo run, we have to understand that there is this invisible gap between our easy effort and our hard effort. And if you're watching this on YouTube, yes, I talk with my hands and I move around a lot. Sorry. So, anyway, the tempo run sort of lies in this gap. And that gap is technically the gap between our aerobic threshold and our anaerobic threshold, which is otherwise known as our lactate threshold. So, our main energy source, our main system that we use for energy in endurance running and long distance running is our aerobic system, right? Aerobic means oxygen. When we run an easy pace, we're using that aerobic system. We want to develop that aerobic system to get better at endurance running. And if you are a 5K specialist, you are still an endurance runner. I used to think, these 5K guys that were out there running these, 7-minute miles, that was like a track dude. No, this 3 miles, 3.1 miles is still considered endurance running. So this applies to you too. So once we start running at anything that is harder than that easy pace, there is a certain point where that effort starts to become more challenging. And that is because our body is shifting from using oxygen to burn the fat and the proteins and the carbohydrates to make energy. And it starts to build up lactic acid in our bloodstream. So our aerobic threshold is that line right there. It's the highest level of exercise intensity that we can perform, that we can run without accumulating significant lactic acid in the blood. So for most of us runners, that pace is actually whatever our current marathon race pace is. So if you've not run a marathon or you've not trained for a marathon, you don't have a sort of definable marathon race point at this point. That is about 1 or 2 minutes per mile faster than what your usual easy long run pace is. Or you can do it by heart rate and say, okay, you want to target your heart rate zone of about 60 to 80% of your maximum heart rate. Okay. So that is your aerobic threshold. That is the point when your body stops using oxygen to power itself and it moves into the anaerobic threshold or the lactate system, anaerobic system, right? Here's something to know before we talk completely about the anaerobic threshold. There is a difference between lactic acid and lactate. They are completely different. A lot of the time, these terms are used interchangeably, but from a science standpoint, they are two different things. The lactate is what is created in our muscles when we're breaking down those carbs and those proteins and those fats for energy. Okay, our cells convert glucose to lactate to use for energy when our oxygen levels start to get low. So this is when we're moving from aerobic, using the oxygen, into the anaerobic. This is called anaerobic glycolysis. So our body actually uses lactate. It is not a bad thing on its own. We have just moved from our aerobic system into our anaerobic system. Lactic acid is created when that lactate joins with a hydrogen ion. And that hydrogen ion is what causes that pesky little burning sensation in our muscles when we are performing intense exercise, which is also what causes us to slow down during our run because it's our body's way of protecting us from acidosis, which is a whole other podcast episode. But it is a warning signal to us, basically. So once we've crossed over the aerobic threshold and the lactate starts to build up, if we keep that same pace, that lactate is going to build up in our system faster than our body can use it for energy. It begins to convert to lactic acid. Our body can't clear it from our system. And that is when we hit our anaerobic threshold or our lactate threshold. Okay. All right. So, what does any of this have to do with running tempo runs? Why does any of this matter? If we can boost our lactate threshold, that anaerobic threshold, we can teach our bodies to clear the lactic acid more efficiently, which means that we can hold a faster pace for longer without that lovely burning sensation kicking in and our legs trying to slow us down. And it also reduces our chances for that acidosis if we ignore that sensation for too long. So good. Now we know why we're trying to train in this manner. Now we have to figure out what exactly that pace is for us, okay? Generally speaking, tempo runs are assigned in intervals. So what would that pace be? For most of us, that is going to be about what we can run for a full 60 minutes at race pace. So if you are somebody who can run a 10K race in less than an hour, then about your 10K pace is what your anaerobic or lactate threshold pace is going to be. So if that's an easier way for you to figure it out versus being your marathon race pace, that's fine. Now, it doesn't mean that you actually want to go out and run for an hour as hard as you can and call it a tempo run. That's not how it means. We want to break it down into manageable process so that we're not racing our training like most of us start out to do. So in an actual tempo run, we are generally running continuously that pace for about 20 to 30 minutes. So we maintain that tempo pace, that race pace, and then we maybe give our system a break before repeating the tempo again. So in doing that, we are pushing that anaerobic threshold, that lactate threshold, further and further away, meaning our system is going to be able to clear that lactic acid more efficiently. We'll be able to run those speeds for longer amounts of time. If we are new to tempo runs, then we should be starting slow, just like any other type of a speed workout. So if you've never done tempo runs before as part of your training, you probably want to start off with maybe just a mile at your threshold pace or 10 or 15 minutes, depending on, where your training is, whatever that looks for you and your fitness, right? And then break that up with a minute or two of just sort of easy jogging and then repeat it. The more we get better at this and the more fit we get, then we can work our way up to longer time frames that we run this for. And eventually we can use the tempo run to achieve a specific goal for a specific race distance. So if you're trying to get better at the 5K, then eventually you might want to be holding your tempo pace or your threshold pace for about 2 miles and then taking that break and then doing it again and repeating. If you are trying to get faster at the 10K, this might be 3 to 4 miles. For a half marathon, this could be 6 miles. And for a full marathon, this could be as much as 12 miles. Now, the faster a runner that you naturally are, because I have run with some of you speedy people out there, then the longer your tempo runs can be because you likely already have a higher anaerobic threshold. So you can push this even further, maybe doing 15 miles at tempo in marathon training if you can stand that, right? The idea is to push our speed, cross that lactate threshold line, then bring it back down again, allow our bodies to clear that lactate, reduce the lactic acid, and then go for it again. And what this does is it lets us spend more time at higher speeds while not pushing ourselves too far and getting ourselves injured. So I think the final important thing to think about here, though, is that when you're introducing this into your training, you want to make sure that you are focused on whatever your current fitness level is and not what you hope that your fitness level will be by the end of your training cycle. So if you are training for a marathon and you're doing these longer distances, if you are targeting your goal marathon pace in your workouts, not your current marathon race pace, but your goal pace, and you constantly end up pushing and crossing over that lactate threshold, then you actually can end up doing more damage than good in your training. So the idea with adding speed work is to raise that aerobic threshold also. So you want to be running easy the majority of the time, and then add in the speed work so that we can run as fast as we possibly can without being forced to slow down from all those burning sensations. So we want to make sure that we are using our current fitness levels and not the fitness level that we hope to be. Because again, we're trying to teach our bodies to be able to clear that lactic acid, and also, use it as fuel when it builds up. So we should be pushing our bodies, but we should also be giving ourselves a break during those tempo runs, right? So overall, when it comes to your tempo runs, it really should be based on effort. Especially right now, if you are training through the summer for a fall race and it's hot and it's humid during all of your workouts, that lactic acid is actually going to build up at a much faster pace just because of the weather conditions. So just because you're planning on going out and using your tempo as, your 10K race pace doesn't mean that that should be what you stick to when the weather conditions are the way that they are in West Central Missouri in July, okay? You want to kind of temper that and understand that your pace is going to have to be adjusted accordingly, because it's going to build up. That lactic acid is going to build up much more quickly, now in the middle of the summer than it will like in that beautiful fall racing condition that we're all hoping for. So just make sure that you kind of temper your efforts, make sure that you're paying attention to your body when you're doing these things, and make sure you're not pushing yourself too far and actually end up causing more harm than good. So hopefully that sort of demystifies the tempo run for you a little bit. I know it helped me to understand the why behind I was doing these things, and it helped me get through and push through when I was feeling like those races or those runs were too hard. And it also gives me the logic behind, okay, this is why I surge, and this is why I take a break, and this is why I surge and take another break. It's all about smart training. So that will do it for me. Kyle will be back next week. I will provide him with some links to the studies and articles that I used as references for this episode, and then hopefully he will post those in the show notes for you in case you want to nerd out about the science just right alongside me. Thanks for listening. Until next time, see ya.